Ancient Rome began as a line drawn in dirt. Not a wall, not a fortress. A furrow, ploughed one morning beneath the 7 hills, and guarded ever after as the edge of the world. Tonight, the entire story of ancient Rome, from the 7 hills to the last emperor, a boy who outlived the office he held. Fall asleep to all of it. Settle in. There is no hurry here. What follows is long, and it is meant to be. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Start with the furrow itself, because everything else grows out of it. The Romans called it the pomerium. The word comes to us through the antiquarian Varro, who broke it apart as post morerium, behind the wall, though even in antiquity the scholars argued about that, and other authorities preferred a derivation meaning before the wall or nearest to it. The disagreement is old and unresolved. What matters is that it named a strip of consecrated ground running around the oldest core of the city. Nothing could be built on it. Nothing could be farmed on it. It was not a defensive work, and for long stretches of Roman history, it did not follow the fortifications at all. The ritual that created it was Etruscan in origin, and it was performed with cattle. A bull and a cow were yoked, the cow set on the inside, and the plough drawn in a circle, so that the earth turned inward, toward the ground that was becoming a city. Where gates were meant to stand, the plough was lifted clear and carried, leaving the soil unbroken. A gate had to be a place where the sacred line simply was not, because a thing that holy could not be walked over every day by ordinary people carrying vegetables. The furrow itself was called the sulcus primigenius, the first furrow, the original cut. Consider what that boundary actually did, because it was not decorative. Inside the pomerium lay the city proper, what the Romans called the urbs. Outside lay territory that merely belonged to Rome, the ager. Law functioned differently on either side. Assemblies organised on military lines had to meet beyond the boundary, out on the field of Mars, because they were understood as an army in formation, and an army could not assemble inside. Weapons were forbidden within it. A general returning from a campaign held military authority right up to the line, and lost it the moment he stepped across, unless the Senate had granted him a triumph, in which case the crossing became a ceremony in its own right, one day of permitted armed entry. And then the power evaporated. Even the ceremonial axes bundled into the rods carried before a magistrate were removed at the boundary within the city. The axe meant the power to execute. Inside, that power was suspended. Foreign envoys from hostile territory were received outside it, in the temple of the war goddess Bellona, because an enemy of the Roman people could not be permitted across. Cleopatra, staying in Rome as Caesar's guest, lodged beyond the line. Now hold that image for a moment. A stretch of empty dirt, unbuilt and unploughed, encircling a crowded ancient city, and the most powerful men alive stopping at it. The boundary was marked with stone. Large travertine blocks, roughly 2 meters tall, set into the ground at intervals, and inscribed with the name of whichever emperor had last extended the line. These are called Scipi, and they are rare. Only about 10 had ever been found in Rome by the middle of the last century, and then, for 100 years, none. In the summer of 2021, during restoration work near the mausoleum of Augustus, archaeologists lifted a travertine block out of the ground, where it had been reused inside a sewer system. It carried an inscription naming the emperor Claudius, and recording that he had extended and remarked the boundary, having enlarged the territory of the Roman people. That last phrase is worth sitting with. The right to move the sacred line was tied, in Roman thinking, to having made Rome bigger. You did not simply decide to expand the city. You earned the right to redraw its edge by extending what lay outside it. Claudius did this in the year 49. Sulla had done it before him, as dictator, roughly 130 years earlier. Vespasian and his son Titus would do it after. Augustus, remarkably, may never have done it at all. He does not mention it in his own account of his achievements, and the question remains open. So the line moved. Slowly, rarely, ceremoniously, and always in one direction, outward. This is the shape of the whole story. a city that began by declaring an absolute boundary and then spent 1,000 years arguing about where it sat and who was allowed to stand inside it. Everything that follows tonight is a version of that argument. Now go back before the stone, before the empire, before the inscriptions, to the ground itself, because the ground is older than the story Rome told about it. The site is not obviously promising, a cluster of hills of no great height above a river with a marshy floodplain, some distance inland from the sea. The valley that would one day hold the forum was, in the beginning, wet ground. Seasonal flooding from the river combined with surface water to make it unusable for settlement. So people lived on the high points and buried their dead in the low ground. That inversion is worth noticing. The most famous public square in the ancient world began as a cemetery on a swamp, on the western edge of the Palatine, in excavations first disturbed in 1907 and then recorded properly in 1948. 3 structures were found cut into the soft volcanic bedrock. Not buildings, the outlines of buildings, post holes, wall slots, drainage gullies. The best preserved was an oblong, perhaps 5 meters by 3.5, with 7 main posts, a small porch formed by 2 more, and a hearth at the centre, wattle and daub, thatched roof, 1 room. Similar structures have been found across the site and at other settlements in the region, dating across a span from roughly the 9th century before the Common Era into the 7th. The occupants cremated their dead, and then, at some point around the middle of the 8th century, began burying them instead, in trenches, with ceramic jars of food and drink. We know roughly what these huts looked like from an unexpected source. Across central Italy, people of this period buried cremated remains in urns modelled as miniature houses, small ceramic huts with sloped roofs and doorways. They were making models of their own homes to hold their dead. Set one beside the post holes on the Palatine, and the two agree. The traditional founding date is the 21st of April, 753 before the Common Era, fixed in the 1st century before the Common Era by the scholar Varro, working backward through king lists. Early excavators noticed with some excitement that the Palatine huts appeared to date to roughly 750. The correspondence looked almost too good. It should be treated carefully. And here, the honest position is one of doubt. Radiocarbon dating has since suggested that the conventional chronology for this whole period may run too young, possibly by as much as a century. The earliest burials in the Forum Valley may go back toward 1,000 years before the Common Era. The huts may be older than the date they were once used to confirm, and the dates themselves, as the historian Mary Beard has put it, remain far from certain. A further problem follows, and it is a live one in the field. In 1988, the archaeologist Andrea Carandini identified an 8th century wall on the Palatine and argued that it corresponded to the fortification attributed in legend to Romulus. The dating rested substantially on pottery found nearby. The claim electrified the public and divided the discipline, and it remains contested. Some scholars regard the identification as a serious reading of genuine evidence. Others regard it as a case of finding the story you went looking for. State it plainly as speculation then. There was a wall. Whether the Romans of the 8th century thought of it as their founder's wall, and whether there was a founder at all, cannot be established from post holes. What the archaeology does establish is less dramatic and more interesting. There was no single moment of foundation. There were villages on hilltops, small, defensible, materially unremarkable, with little sign of sharp social division in either the living quarters or the graves. Over generations, those villages coalesced. The marshy valley between them was drained under later kings, and became shared ground. What had been several settlements became one. Rome was not founded, Rome accumulated, and that is the first place where the story Rome told about itself, and the ground beneath it come apart. The Romans wanted a founder, a date, a furrow, and a single act of will. The evidence offers a slow merging of neighbours, who had been living within sight of each other for centuries. Both accounts, oddly, point the same way, whether by myth or by mud. Rome starts as a joining of separate groups into one. Which brings us to the strangest part of the founding legend, and the part that most deserves your attention tonight. In the standard telling, Romulus kills his brother over the boundary. Remus leaps the furrow, or mocks it, and dies for it. The moral is unambiguous. The line is holier than a brother. Then, almost immediately, the same man opens a door in it. According to Livy, Romulus consecrated a place of refuge in the wooded dip between the two summits of the Capitoline, the saddle of ground between the citadel and the Temple Hill. The Latin word for it is asylum. Anyone who came there was safe. Debtors, exiles, men fleeing prosecution in neighbouring towns, runaway slaves, the dispossessed of the whole region. Come here, whatever you have done, and be one of us. The archaeological question of whether such a sanctuary physically existed is unsettled. Excavations beneath the Capitoline have found early remains, and one scholarly argument connects a village between the two heights to the refuge tradition, while others consider the identified space far too small, treat it as unresolved. But the legend's existence is not in doubt, and the legend is what matters, because the Romans believed it about themselves and repeated it for 1,000 years. Here the narrator is going to take a position because the standard handling of this story is wrong. It is often presented as an embarrassment, a shameful origin that later Roman writers had to explain away, a story about criminals, and refuse that a proud imperial people would rather have replaced with something cleaner. That reading gets it backwards. The Romans kept telling it because they understood it as an advantage. Compare the alternative. Athens told a story of autochthony. The Athenians had sprung from the very soil of Attica, born of the land itself, related to no one else, diluted by no one. It is a beautiful story and a closed one. It tells you exactly who counts, and the answer never changes. Rome told the opposite story, and told it twice. In one version, the founding population is a collection of fugitives with nowhere else to go. In the other, older and grander, the ancestral figure is Aeneas, a refugee from a burned city on the far side of the sea, arriving in Italy with nothing. As Mary Beard has observed, this is a national origin myth that insists the original Romans were foreigners. No other major ancient state said that about itself. And there were Romans who said it out loud as a point of pride. The tradition preserves outsiders remarking on Roman inclusiveness as the source of Roman strength, and Romans agreeing. Whether any of this happened is beside the point. A story a people tells about itself for a millennium becomes a set of instructions. Rome's instructions said, the boundary is sacred, and there is a door in it, and the door is how we grow. The whole of what follows, the plebeian secessions, the Latin allies, the freedmen, the auxiliary diplomas, the Gallic senators, the universal grant of the year 212, is that instruction being carried out, resisted, expanded, and finally exhausted. Hold on to the two images, a furrow no one may cross, a gap in the furrow where anyone may enter. Rome is what happens when a society takes both of those seriously at the same time. Now, the kings, and here the ground under the story is unusually soft. Roman tradition counted 7 kings, beginning with Romulus and ending with a tyrant. The list is neat, and neatness in early source material is a warning sign. 7 reigns are asked to fill roughly 2.5 centuries, which gives each king an implausibly long tenure. The individual figures carry suspiciously tidy functions. One founds the city, the next establishes its religion, another builds its institutions, another its walls. Some of these men may be composite, some may be entirely invented. The safest position is that the outline preserves genuine memory of a monarchy, while the details were shaped, and in places manufactured, by writers working centuries later. What survives from that period is not the biography, it is the furniture. Several of Rome's oldest religious offices, its calendar, the College of Priests, the shape of the early assemblies. These were understood by Romans as inheritances from the kings, and there is no strong reason to doubt that they are genuinely archaic. There is also the Etruscan question. The last three kings in the tradition bear Etruscan names, and Etruscan influence on early Rome is visible in ritual, in engineering, and in the alphabet the Romans adopted. The great drainage works that turned the marshy valley into the Forum are credited to this period, and draining a floodplain is not a small undertaking for a village. That drainage is the physical act that made the city possible. Several hilltop communities became one settlement, when the wet ground between them turned into shared, walkable, buildable space. One detail here would be used by Claudius himself, 500 years later, and it is worth planting now. In his speech to the Senate, the emperor cited Etruscan tradition to argue that one of Rome's early kings had been an outsider who came to the city and rose to rule it. He was making a point about who was permitted to hold office, and he reached for the monarchy to make it. The kings, in other words, were remembered as evidence that Rome had always taken in strangers and let them lead. The monarchy ended, according to tradition, around 509 before the Common Era, in a revolt against the last king. The story involves an outrage committed by a royal son, a noblewoman's death, and an aristocratic uprising that expelled the family and abolished the office. The details are the stuff of later moralizing literature. The consequence, however, is structural and real. Rome ended up with two annually elected magistrates, holding the executive power the kings had held, each able to block the other, both leaving office. After a year, the Romans developed a horror of monarchy so deep that it shaped their politics for 5 centuries and forced their first emperor into elaborate contortions to avoid looking like a king. And notice what the expulsion did to the boundary. The line no longer protected a royal household. It enclosed a community of citizens who governed themselves, a body with a membership, and therefore a question about membership. That question arrived almost immediately, and it came from inside. Rome had thrown out its king and kept its aristocracy. The men who ran the new republic called themselves patricians. The name probably derives from patras, fathers, applied to the earliest members of the Senate, from whom these families claimed descent. Membership was hereditary. You were born into it or you were not. And for most of the early republic there was no mechanism by which that changed. Everyone else was the plebs, not necessarily poor. Some plebeian families were substantially wealthy, and the label as a synonym for the lower orders is a much later development. What defined them was exclusion. The magistracies were closed to them, the priesthoods were closed to them, the Senate was closed to them, and they were the majority. The conflict that followed lasted roughly 2 centuries, from around 494 before the Common Era to 287. The Romans remembered it as a struggle of the orders. What is remarkable about it, given how Roman politics would end, is how little blood it involved. The plebeian weapon was not the sword. It was absence. When grievances became intolerable, the plebeians left. They walked out of the city in a body and encamped on a hill outside, and they refused to work, and refused to serve in the army until they were heard. The Romans called this a secession of the plebs. It is a general strike, invented roughly 2,500 years ago, by people who had noticed that a city cannot function or defend itself without the people who do most of its labour and most of its fighting. Tradition records perhaps 5 such withdrawals. The first, around 494, produced the office of the tribune of the plebs, a magistrate elected only by plebeians, empowered to block the acts of other magistrates by simple veto. The tribunes were declared sacrosanct. To harm one was a religious crime punishable by death, an office created by a walkout, protected by a curse. The next demand was for written law. The plebeian argument was elegantly simple and difficult to answer. If the law is unwritten and only patricians know it, then the law is whatever patricians say it is. How can a citizen respect a rule he is not permitted to read? The result? Around 450 before the Common Era was the 12 Tables, Rome's first published legal code, drafted by a commission of 10 men and set up for public view. The tables themselves do not survive. What we have are quotations and paraphrases in later authors. from which the content has been partially reconstructed. Much of it is procedural, technical, and unromantic. Rules about summonses, debts, inheritance, property boundaries, the correct handling of disputes between neighbours. One provision was not technical at all. The 11th table forbade marriage between patricians and plebeians. Read that again with the whole of tonight's story in mind. The first written law code of the Roman people includes a clause designed to make the internal boundary permanent, to ensure that no family could cross from one order to the other by the ordinary mechanism through which families have always merged. It was a wall built inside the pomerium. It lasted 5 years. In 445 before the Common Era, a plebeian tribune named Gaius Cannae proposed its repeal. The consuls opposed him in the strongest terms available, arguing that he was proposing the collapse of Rome's social and moral order at a moment of external danger. This is a rhetorical move with a long future ahead of it. Cannae, according to the tradition preserved in Livy, made an argument that goes directly to the heart of everything we are following tonight. He reminded the assembled Romans that men of humble birth had risen to the highest positions, that several of the kings themselves had not been born to it, and he pointed out that the Senate had granted Roman citizenship to outsiders. If Rome could admit foreigners, on what principle did it refuse to let its own citizens marry each other? The measure passed. Modern scholarship is divided on the details and on whether the episode is historical in the form Livy gives it. Some argue the repeal belongs to a later reforming moment, but the direction of travel is not in doubt. The internal line began to dissolve, one statute at a time. In 367 before the Common Era came, the laws requiring that one of the 2 annual consuls be a plebeian, breaking the aristocratic monopoly on the highest office. Since former magistrates entered the Senate, this opened the Senate as well. In 300, plebeians gained access to the major priesthoods, which mattered because Roman religion and Roman politics were not separable activities. In 287, after a final withdrawal, a law made the resolutions of the plebeian assembly binding on every Roman citizen, including patricians, without requiring senatorial approval. That is conventionally where the struggle of the orders ends. It is worth being clear-eyed about what it achieved and what it did not. Rome did not become democratic. What emerged was a new governing class of wealthy families. Patrician and plebeian together, that would dominate office holding for centuries. The poor remained poor. The assemblies were structured so that wealth counted more than numbers. The barrier moved. It did not disappear. But something had been established that would matter enormously later. At Rome, the composition of the ruling body was negotiable. It could be argued with. It could be widened under pressure without the state collapsing. Athens, at the height of its democracy, tightened its citizenship law to require that both parents be Athenian. Rome, over the same broad period, was doing the reverse, grinding down its internal distinctions, and preparing, without any plan, to do the same thing to its external ones, which is where the next expansion begins, and it begins with neighbours. Before any of that, Rome nearly ended. The first great external test came from the north, and it came at a moment when the city was still a regional power of no particular distinction. Sometime around 390 before the Common Era, the traditional date, though some sources suggest a few years later, a Gallic force moved down into central Italy. The Romans met them at a river called the Allia, north of the city, and were routed comprehensively. What happened next entered Roman memory as the worst thing that had ever happened. The Gauls took the city. Most of the population fled. According to the tradition, a garrison held out on the Capitoline, while the rest of Rome was sacked and burned. And the defenders were saved from a night attack when the sacred geese kept at the temple raised the alarm. The Gauls eventually withdrew, either bought off with gold or driven out, depending on which version a Roman writer preferred. There is a famous scene in the tradition in which the Gallic leader, weighing out the ransom, throws his sword onto the scales, and remarks that the vanquished have no say in the terms. Historians treat the details with considerable caution. The archaeological evidence for a general destruction of the city at this period is thinner than the literary account would suggest, and much of the narrative has the shape of a moral fable assembled later. What is not in doubt is the psychological residue. The Gallic sack became the reference point for catastrophe. Centuries afterward, Roman writers reached for it the way later Europeans reached for plague years. The anniversary of the Alia was marked as an unlucky day in the calendar. Fear of a repeat invasion from the north shaped Roman policy for generations, which is one reason the enormous mobilization of 225 was directed at a Gallic threat rather than at Carthage. And it surfaces again, 438 years later, in the Senate House, when Claudius stood up to argue that Gallic notables should be allowed to hold office at Rome. Part of the case against him was precisely this, that these were the people who had burned the city. The memory was still being used as an argument about who could belong. Claudius answered it, in effect, by pointing out that Rome had been absorbing former enemies since before it had walls. The city was rebuilt hastily and badly. Roman writers later complained that the irregular street plan of their own capital, so unlike the neat grids of the colonies they founded elsewhere, dated from that scramble. Rome recovered, and then it did something more consequential than recovering. It began, methodically, to make sure this could not happen again, which meant controlling the territory around it, which meant war with its neighbours, which meant the long, grinding conquest of Italy. Rome spent the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era fighting its way to control of the Italian peninsula. Latin neighbours, then the hill peoples of the Apennines, then the Greek cities of the south. These were long, hard, frequently unsuccessful wars against opponents who were not obviously weaker. What Rome did with the defeated is the thing that made it different. The ordinary ancient practice on winning a war was to extract tribute, install a garrison, and treat the beaten community as a subject population to be taxed and watched. Rome did some of that. It also did something else. It offered membership. The system that emerged was graded, and the gradations mattered. Some conquered communities received full Roman citizenship with the vote. Some received citizenship without the vote, full civil rights, no political ones. Some received what became known as Latin rights, a package of legal privileges short of full citizenship. That package is worth naming because it shows exactly what Rome thought belonging consisted of. There was the right to trade, meaning to make contracts with Roman citizens on equal terms and to use Roman legal forms. There was the right to marry, for a marriage to be recognized as legally valid across the boundary, with the consequences that carries for inheritance and legitimacy. And there was the right of migration, allowing a person to move to another community and retain status, trade, marriage, movement. The three things that make separate populations into one population over time. Later, in the settlement of the Italian wars, the magistrates of towns holding Latin rights were themselves granted full Roman citizenship, as a matter of course. So the arrangement contained a staircase. Serve your own town, and you personally become Roman. Your successors do the same. Over generations, the local elite of a Latin community becomes a Roman elite without a single additional decree. Alongside this, Rome planted colonies, settlements of citizens and Latins on newly held ground, connected by the roads Rome was building for its armies. Each colony carried Roman law, Roman religious practice, Roman civic architecture and, according to the tradition, its own ploughed boundary at foundation. The furrow was exported. Every new town got its own line. The allied communities of Italy, the Socii, were bound to Rome by individual treaties. They kept internal autonomy and their own governments. In exchange, they supplied soldiers. That last obligation is the hinge of the next 2 centuries, and its scale is easy to underestimate. The historian Polybius, writing for a Greek audience, recorded the manpower available to Rome and its allies in 225 before the Common Era, on the eve of a Gallic invasion scare. The figures he gives are enormous, something in the order of 70,000 Romans mobilized, alongside something like 100 and 70,000 allied troops, plus tens of thousands more from Gallic peoples in the north. The allies outnumbered the Romans substantially. By the time of the Great War with Carthage, the ratio of allied soldiers to Roman soldiers in the field was roughly 3-2. Sit with what that means. The military power everyone would come to call Roman was, in raw numbers, mostly not Roman. It was Italian, drawn from dozens of communities with their own languages, their own gods, and their own memories of having been defeated by Rome. Rome had turned its conquests into its army. Carthage was about to discover what that meant, and the discovery would take 20 years. Carthage was not a lesser power. It was a Phoenician foundation on the North African coast, older than the Roman Republic, wealthy from maritime trade, with a formidable navy and a long reach across the western Mediterranean. The first war between them, fought largely at sea over Sicily, lasted more than 2 decades and cost both sides catastrophically. That first conflict deserves a moment of its own because of what it revealed about Roman temperament. Carthage was the naval power. Rome was not. Rome had no significant war fleet, no tradition of maritime combat, and no obvious reason to acquire either, and the war was being fought over an island. So Rome built a navy. According to the tradition, the design was copied from a captured Carthaginian warship that had run aground, and crews were trained on benches set up on dry land, while the hulls were still being assembled. The Romans then declined to fight the war the way a naval power would. Rather than attempting to outmaneuver ships crewed by generations of sailors, they fitted their vessels with a boarding bridge, a hinged gangway with a spike at the end that dropped onto an enemy deck and held it fast. The device turned a sea battle into an infantry engagement, which was the one thing Rome knew how to win. The cost was appalling. Roman fleets were lost repeatedly to storms, in numbers that dwarfed their combat losses, and each time the ships and the men were replaced. One ancient estimate of the total drowned across the war runs to figures that are difficult to predict and impossible to dismiss. Rome won, took Sicily, and shortly afterward took Sardinia as well, in circumstances that Polybius himself considered indefensible. The pattern established there recurs. Rome loses catastrophically, refuses to accept the result, rebuilds, and comes back. It is not tactical brilliance. It is an unusual institutional capacity to absorb disaster without the political system collapsing, which is, once again, a function of who was invested in the outcome. The second war is the one that matters for tonight. In 218, before the Common Era, the Carthaginian general Hannibal took an army out of Spain, through southern Gaul, across the Alps, and down into the plain of northern Italy. The march is justly famous. What he did afterward is more instructive. At the river Trebia in the winter of that year, he destroyed a Roman army. At Lake Trasimene the following spring, he destroyed another in an ambush. And in the summer of 216, near a village called Cannae in the southeast, he did something that military historians have studied ever since. The Romans came at him with an enormous force, something in the region of 86,000 men, Romans, allies together, massed deep in the centre. Hannibal arranged his own line so that the middle gave way slowly under the pressure, drawing the Roman mass forward while his stronger flanks held, and his cavalry cleared the wings and came round behind. The Roman army was enveloped and destroyed. Polybius puts the dead at 70,000. Livy gives lower figures, closer to 50,000 killed with many more captured. Either way, it was one of the most lethal single days of battle in recorded history. One consul died on the field. The historian Adrian Goldsworthy has compared the scale of the killing to the first day of the Somme. Rome had now lost 3 field armies in 3 years. And here is the thing that should have ended the war. Hannibal's strategy was never to capture Rome by storm. He did not have the numbers or the siege capacity. His plan was to demonstrate, repeatedly and unmistakably, that Rome could be beaten, and then to let the alliance system do the work. The Italian communities supplying most of Rome's soldiers would see that the hegemon was breakable, and they would defect, and the machine would come apart from the inside. It was a good plan. Against any comparable state it would have worked. It partly worked. After Cannae, Capua went over to him, a city of real weight, whose defection brought others. Communities across the south changed sides. In the north, the Gallic peoples had already joined him. Hannibal built an Italian coalition of his own and campaigned in Italy for years, but the system held. Most of the Latin communities stayed loyal. The core of the alliance in central Italy stayed loyal, and Rome, having lost tens of thousands of men in a single afternoon, lowered the draft age, enrolled debtors, criminals, and armed slaves with the promise of freedom, and raised new legions. It kept doing this, year after year. It refused to negotiate. Here is the interpretive point, and it is the reason the Punic Wars belong, in a story about boundaries rather than a story about generals. Hannibal won every major engagement he chose to fight, and lost the war, because he was fighting a state whose real weapon was not its army, but its membership. Every Italian community that stayed loyal did so for its own reasons: fear, local rivalry, calculation about who would win. But a great many of them had something concrete to lose. They had legal privileges. Their leading men had paths to Roman status. Their sons served in units alongside Romans and came home with plunder. Rome had spent 2 centuries converting defeated enemies into stakeholders, and when the test came, the stakeholders mostly stayed. The response to defection tells the same story from the other side. When Capua was retaken in 211, the punishment was severe, the leading citizens executed, a community stripped of self-government. Rome could be merciless with those who left. The door swung inward. It was not supposed to swing back out. The war ended in Africa in 202, when a Roman commander finally beat Hannibal in the field. Carthage survived, reduced. Half a century later, Rome went back and destroyed it entirely. By the middle of the 2nd century, before the Common Era, Rome controlled the Western Mediterranean, had broken the Hellenistic kingdoms in the east, and had no serious rival anywhere. It had won using a system built on Italian manpower and graded belonging. And it was about to discover that the same system was tearing the inside of the state apart. Victory did something to Italy that no one had planned, and no one could stop. The Roman army of the Middle Republic was built on the smallholder. A citizen with enough property to equip himself served when called, fought a campaign, and came home to his farm. The system assumed short wars close to home. The wars were no longer short and no longer close to home. A man could be gone for years, in Spain or Macedonia or Africa. Meanwhile, his land went untended, his family went into debt, and the harvest failed without him. At the same time, the conquests were producing captives on a scale the Mediterranean had not seen. Enslaved people arrived in Italy in enormous numbers, and the wealthy bought them and used them to work the large estates they were assembling out of land the state had taken in war, and the small holdings their neighbours could no longer keep. The result was a slow, grinding transfer. Small farms became large estates worked by slaves. Displaced families drifted toward the city, and the pool of men who met the property qualification for military service began to shrink. That last consequence is the one that alarmed the governing class, because it was an arithmetic problem with a military answer. Fewer qualifying smallholders meant fewer soldiers. The system that had beaten Hannibal was eroding its own foundation. There was public land available, territory confiscated from defeated communities, technically owned by the state. An old law limited how much of it any one person could occupy. The limit was widely ignored, and the largest occupiers were the men who would have to vote on any attempt to enforce it. Into this walked Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. He came from the top of Roman society. His father had been consul and censor. His mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of the general, who had finally beaten Hannibal. He had served in Africa and in Spain, where he had negotiated a humiliating treaty to save a surrounded army, and had watched the Senate repudiate it. Elected tribune of the plebs for the year 133, he proposed to enforce the existing limit on public land and redistribute the recovered surplus in small plots to landless citizens. The plots were to be inalienable. They could not simply be sold back to the wealthy, and they would carry a nominal rent so the state could tell whether they had been abandoned. He was not proposing to touch private property. He was proposing to apply a law that already existed. The opposition was ferocious, and it came dressed in constitutional language. Another tribune vetoed the bill. Tiberius responded by having the assembly vote his colleague out of office, which was unprecedented and arguably illegal. When the Senate obstructed funding, he seized on the arrival of a bequest. The kingdom of Pergamon, willed to Rome by its dying king, and proposed that the assembly allocate the money directly, bypassing the Senate's traditional control of foreign revenue. Then, he stood for a second consecutive tribunate. Each step had a defense. Together they looked, to his enemies, like a man building a personal power base outside the normal constraints. In the summer of 133, a group of senators, led by the chief priest of the Roman state, who was also his cousin, went into the assembly with improvised weapons and beat Tiberius Gracchus to death, along with a large number of his supporters. The bodies were thrown into the river. His land commission continued its work. His brother Gaius, 10 years later, went considerably further. Grain subsidies, colonies, judicial reform, the reorganization of tax collection in the province of Asia, and, fatally, a proposal to extend citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. That last measure destroyed him. Existing citizens did not want their privileges diluted, and his opponents used the fear. In 121, the Senate passed an emergency decree. The consul led armed men against Gaius and his followers, and Gaius died, by his own hand or in the fighting. Appian, writing much later, identified this as the moment weapons entered Roman politics. The narrator's reading here is that the Gracchi are usually remembered for the wrong reason. They are remembered as social reformers, which they were. The more consequential thing they did was demonstrate a method, that a tribune, backed by the assembly, could bypass the Senate entirely, and that the Senate would respond with murder rather than accept it. Every major figure of the next century used the first lesson. The Republic never recovered from the second, and the proposal that killed Gaius Gracchus, citizenship for the Italians, did not go away. It came back with an army behind it. The grievance was straightforward and had been accumulating for a century. The Italian allies had supplied the majority of the soldiers who built the empire. They fought Rome's wars, took Rome's casualties, and received a disproportionately small share of the land and none of the political rights. They had no vote on whether wars were declared or how the spoils were divided. They wanted in. There had been attempts. Gaius Gracchus had tried and died. Others had tried and been blocked. And in 95 before the Common Era, Rome did something considerably worse than refuse. A law was passed, setting up an investigation into Latins and Italians who had registered themselves as Roman citizens on the rolls, with the aim of striking them off. It was, in effect, a purge of the citizen list, a formal declaration that the boundary would not only stay closed, but be retroactively enforced against people who had already crossed. Modern historians regard that law as one of the direct causes of the war that followed. In 91, a tribune named Marcus Livius Drusus proposed enfranchising the Italians as part of a broader reform package. He was assassinated. The response was not a riot. It was a nation. The Italian communities that rose, the Marsi, the Samnites, the Picentes, the Paeligni, the Lucanians. Others did not simply raise troops. They formed a confederation. They took the town of Corfinium as a capital and renamed it Italia. They established a senate. They elected magistrates. They struck their own coinage. Some of that coinage carried an image of a bull goring a wolf. They built, in other words, a replacement Rome, and they staffed its armies with men who had spent their careers in Roman legions and fought exactly the way Roman legions fought, because that is where they had learned. The war ran from 91 to 88, with holdouts into 87. It was fought the length of Italy, and it was appallingly costly. One ancient source puts the dead at 300,000. The figure is probably inflated. The scale is not in doubt. Rome won it militarily. Commanders including Sulla and Pompey Strabo turned the tide by the year 89. But look at how Rome won it. In 90, the consul Lucius Julius Caesar carried a law granting citizenship to Italian communities that had not taken up arms. In the same year, another measure allowed commanders to grant citizenship in the field, as a reward for valour. In 89 came a further law offering citizenship to those who had rebelled, provided they laid down their arms and presented themselves to a praetor within 60 days. A separate measure extended Latin rights to the communities north of the River Po. Rome ended the rebellion by conceding what the rebellion was about. There was a sting in it. The new citizens were initially enrolled in a limited number of voting tribes, which diluted the practical value of their votes, a piece of administrative sharp practice that took years to unwind. Even so, the substance had changed permanently. Almost the entire peninsula was now Roman. Autonomous allied communities became municipia within a single state. Here the narrator wants to be direct, because this war is chronically underweighted in popular accounts of Rome. The social war is the most consequential conflict in Roman history that most people have never heard of. And Rome lost it in the only sense that finally mattered. The legions won the battles. The Italians won the argument. Every objective they had gone to war for was granted by statute within 3 years. And the effect was to transform the meaning of the word Roman. It stopped being a description of where you were from and became a description of your legal standing. A man from the Samnite Hills whose grandfather had fought against Rome was now a Roman citizen, and so was everyone he knew. The pomerium still ran around the same few hills. The citizen body now covered a peninsula. Rome had done again, under duress, what it had done to its own patrician monopoly. Moved the line outward and survived it. What it did not survive was the way the war had been won. The social war had put enormous armies into the field under commanders who had recruited and paid and rewarded them personally. And in 88, before the Common Era, one of those commanders did something no Roman had done. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, elected consul, was assigned a lucrative eastern command. The assembly, manoeuvred by a tribune, transferred it to his rival Gaius Marius. Sulla left the city, went to his army, and told his soldiers what had happened. Then he marched on Rome. His officers, with one exception, refused to go with him. The soldiers went. They crossed the sacred boundary under arms, and the city fell to a Roman general leading Roman troops for the first time in its history. That crossing is the single most important boundary violation in this entire story, and it was committed by a man defending the traditional order. Marius fled, returned while Sulla was campaigning in the east, and conducted a slaughter of his enemies. Sulla came back, won a civil war, and became dictator. He then instituted the proscriptions, lists of names posted publicly, the men on them declared outlaws, killable by anyone, their property confiscated, their descendants barred from office. Killing your political enemies became an administrative procedure with paperwork. Sulla used his power to strengthen the Senate, curtail the tribunate, and restore what he understood as the ancestral constitution. Then he resigned, which is the genuinely astonishing part, and retired. The restoration did not hold. What held was the precedent. There is a standard account of this period that credits Gaius Marius with a set of sweeping military reforms, abolishing the property qualification, opening the legions to the landless, and thereby creating professional armies loyal to generals rather than the state. That account deserves skepticism. The historian Brett Devereaux has argued at length that the so-called Marian reforms were not a coherent program enacted in a single year, and that several of the changes attributed to Marius happened gradually, before and after him, or did not happen at all. The honest version is less tidy and more troubling. The property qualification had been drifting downward for generations as the pool of qualified men shrank. Commanders had been rewarding their veterans with land for decades. The relationship between soldiers and their generals had been personalizing slowly. through 100 small accommodations, and no one decided it, which means there was no reform to reverse. There was only a structure that had quietly changed shape underneath everyone. By the 70s before the Common Era, a Roman army was a body of men whose land grants on discharge depended on their commander's political standing. Their interests and his were the same. When he told them the Senate had wronged him, they had reason to believe it and reason to care. The furrow around the city was still there. Sulla had even extended it, as dictator, adding to the sacred line, while demonstrating exactly how little it now constrained anyone with soldiers. The boundary that had been designed to keep armed power out of the city had been crossed by an army, and the sky had not fallen. Everyone who came afterward knew that. Pause the political narrative for a moment, because a courtroom in the year 70 before the Common Era shows us what all of this actually meant to a person standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The defendant was Gaius Verus, recently governor of Sicily. The charge was extortion. The prosecutor was a rising lawyer from a provincial town called Arpinum, not yet famous, named Marcus Tullius Cicero. Verus had spent 3 years stripping the province, temples looted, farmers ruined, judicial decisions sold, works of art removed from private houses. Cicero assembled the evidence in Sicily and brought it to Rome, and the case against Verus was so overwhelming that his defense counsel, the leading orator of the day, effectively advised him to leave the country. He did. Among everything Cicero laid out, one episode did the most damage. A man named Publius Gavius had been arrested. He appears to have publicly denounced Verus, which was his offence. He was stripped and flogged in the open, in the market square at Messina, on the northeastern tip of Sicily, in view of the strait that separates the island from Italy. Throughout the flogging, according to Cicero, Gavius shouted the same words. He was a Roman citizen. Under Roman law, that claim was supposed to be decisive. A citizen possessed the right of appeal, the ius provocationis, a protection traced back to the earliest years of the Republic. A magistrate could not simply flog or execute a citizen on his own authority. The citizen could appeal, and until the appeal was resolved, no punishment could be inflicted. Verus flogged him anyway. Then he crucified him, and the detail Cicero seized on, the one that turned a legal argument into a weapon, was the placement of the cross. Verus had it raised on ground overlooking the water, facing Italy, so that a dying man could see the country whose citizenship had failed to save him. Read the speech, and you can still feel the temperature of it. Cicero's argument is not principally that a man was murdered. Though he makes that argument, it is that the words had been rendered meaningless, and that, if those words meant nothing, then nothing held the empire together. He understood the mechanism exactly. Roman citizenship functioned as a guarantee that worked at enormous distance, in places where Rome had no daily presence, because everyone believed it would be enforced. A citizen could travel from Britain to Syria, alone, unarmed, carrying nothing but a status. The guarantee held not because the provinces loved Rome, but because they knew precisely what Rome would do to anyone who tested it. Verus had tested it, publicly, on a hilltop, in front of witnesses. The jury convicted. The verdict was, among other things, a decision that the guarantee would continue to mean what it said. A second scene, a century and a bit later, shows the same machinery working from the other direction. The Book of Acts describes a man arrested in Jerusalem after a public disturbance, taken into the barracks by the garrison. The commander ordered him examined by flogging, which was ordinary procedure for extracting information from someone with no standing. As they stretched him out, the prisoner asked the centurion standing beside him whether it was lawful to flog a Roman citizen who had not been condemned. The account describes what follows with some care. The centurion goes immediately to his commanding officer. The commander comes and asks the man directly whether he is a citizen, and is told yes. The commander then says something revealing that he had acquired this citizenship himself, and it had cost him a great deal. The prisoner answers that he was born to it. Those about to conduct the examination withdraw at once. and the commander is described as afraid because he had already put a Roman citizen in chains. Two details in that exchange are worth holding. The first is that a Roman officer in Judea, on hearing a claim of citizenship from a man he was about to torture, stopped and was frightened. Cicero's guarantee was still functioning 130 years later, at the far edge of the empire, and the men enforcing Roman power knew where the line was and did not want to be found on the wrong side of it. The second is the officer's remark about the price. He had bought his status, or paid for it in years of service, and he says so with the slight resentment of a man who has worked for something another person received free, which is, in one sentence, the entire economics of Roman citizenship. It was expensive, it was worth having, people spent decades acquiring it, and they noticed who had not. Remember that officer when we reach the year 212. Gaius Julius Caesar spent most of the 50s before the Common Era in Gaul, and what he did there is relevant to tonight's line. In a way, the campaigns themselves are not. He conquered a very large territory over roughly 8 years in fighting of extraordinary brutality. Ancient estimates of the dead and enslaved run into the high hundreds of thousands, and while those figures come substantially from Caesar's own account and should be treated with caution, the destruction was on a scale that would later trouble even some Romans. He also created citizens, grants of Roman status to loyal provincials, to communities that had supported him, to auxiliary units that had fought well. He was building a clientele across a province, and citizenship was the currency. The Gaul he left behind would, within a century, be producing men who wanted seats in the Roman Senate. We will get to them. The war that ended the Republic began over a technicality about boundaries. A Roman magistrate holding command in a province possessed military authority within that province. Bringing an army out of it toward Italy without authorization was not permitted. The northern edge of Caesar's command was marked by a small river called the Rubicon. His enemies in the Senate intended to have him lay down his command, return to Rome as a private citizen, and face prosecution. Caesar wanted to stand for the consulship without giving up his army first, because giving up his army meant giving up his protection. In January of 49, before the Common Era, he crossed the river with a legion. The line he broke was legal rather than sacred, but the logic is identical to the pomerium. Authority stopped at an agreed edge, and the agreement worked only while everybody honoured it. Sulla had shown 40 years earlier that it could be ignored. Caesar demonstrated that the lesson had been learned. The civil war ran for 4 years across Italy, Spain, Greece, Egypt, and Africa. Caesar won it. Pompey, his old ally and eventual opponent, was murdered on an Egyptian beach. The campaign is worth a little more detail, because it demonstrates how completely the old constraints had dissolved. Caesar pursued Pompey to Greece and beat him at Pharsalus in 48, a battle in which Roman legions destroyed Roman legions, and the survivors were, in many cases, simply enrolled into the winning army. Pompey fled to Egypt and was killed on landing by officials of a court, calculating which way the wind was blowing. Caesar arrived days later and was presented with the head. He then spent months in Alexandria, entangled in an Egyptian dynastic dispute and in a relationship with one of the claimants, and installed Cleopatra on the throne. He fought further campaigns in Asia Minor, in North Africa, and in Spain, where the last organised opposition was finally destroyed in 45. Consider the geography. A dispute about whether one Roman magistrate could keep his command had been settled by fighting across the entire Mediterranean, using armies that were supposed to exist for the defence of the state. Between campaigns, Caesar governed. He settled veterans in colonies across the provinces, which spread citizens outward at scale. He extended the franchise to communities in northern Italy. He enrolled provincials into the Senate, including men from Gaul, which produced a great deal of sneering in Rome, and which was, in substance, the same argument Claudius would win 90 years later. He reformed the calendar, correcting a drift that had pushed the civic year badly out of alignment with the seasons, and the structure he imposed is essentially the one still in use. and he accumulated titles. Dictator repeatedly, then dictator for life, a statue among those of the kings, his portrait on the coinage, which no living Roman had managed before. The men who killed him included some who had fought against him and been pardoned. That is the part later Romans found hardest to explain, and Caesar's clemency towards defeated opponents, genuine, calculated, repeatedly extended, has been read ever since as either his finest quality or the mistake that killed him. Caesar returned to Rome holding power no Republican Roman had held. Dictator, eventually for life. He filled the Senate with his supporters, including provincials, which offended people considerably. He reformed the calendar, which is why the months still run the way they do. And on the 15th of March, 44 before the Common Era, a group of senators killed him. The location deserves a moment, because it is precise and it is not an accident. The Senate was meeting that day, not in its usual house, but in a hall attached to Pompey's theatre complex, out on the Field of Mars, that is outside the Pomerium. Caesar died on ground where military authority was legal, and the sacred prohibitions of the city did not run. He was killed beyond the line. What followed was 13 more years of civil war, ending at a sea battle off the western coast of Greece in 31 before the Common Era, after which Caesar's adopted heir stood alone. His name was Gaius Octavius. History knows him as Augustus, and the problem he faced was the most delicate in Roman political history. He held absolute power, and he could not be seen to hold it. Rome had spent 5 centuries defining itself against monarchy. Caesar had reached for permanent supremacy openly and been stabbed to death by his colleagues. The younger man had watched that happen and drawn conclusions. What he built was a system that has been argued over ever since, and the argument is instructive because the ambiguity was the point. In January of 27 before the Common Era, he came before the Senate and formally surrendered his extraordinary powers, returning the state, in his own later words, to the Senate and people of Rome. The Senate responded by granting him command of a large group of provinces, including Spain, Gaul, Syria and Egypt, which happened to contain the overwhelming majority of the legions. It also gave him a new name, Augustus, a word carrying sacred connotations, connected to augury and to increase. A second settlement 4 years later refined the arrangement. He gave up holding the consulship year after year, which had begun to look conspicuous, and instead took the powers of a tribune of the plebs without the office, the right to convene the Senate, to propose legislation, to veto, and personal inviolability, along with a form of provincial command that did not lapse when he crossed the sacred boundary into the city. That last detail is exactly the technical problem this whole story has been circling. Under the old rules, military authority died at the Pomerium. Augustus arranged to hold a command that did not. The furrow was still there. It simply no longer applied to him. In the account of his achievements that he left to be inscribed after his death, Augustus described his position with a formula that historians have been unpicking for 2,000 years. He surpassed everyone in influence, he wrote, but possessed no more official power than his colleagues in office. The word for influence is auctoritas. It is not a magistracy. It cannot be granted or measured. It means the weight a man's opinion carries, and in the mouth of someone commanding most of the army, it means everything. Scholarly opinion on the Augustan settlement has moved considerably. The 19th century reading treated it as a genuine constitutional arrangement, a sharing of power between princeps and senate. Most modern scholars regard it as a monarchy wearing republican clothing, and pay more attention to the theatre than to the constitutional architecture. The theatre was superb, temples restored, a moral programme legislated, poets producing a national literature, a building campaign in marble, festivals, an account of his own deeds inscribed on bronze and copied across the empire. Tacitus, writing a century later with a senator's bitterness, described the process differently. The chains, he suggested, tightened by degrees. Both things were true. Augustus ended a century of civil war, and Romans were exhausted enough to accept the price. He also established that one man would hold power for life and be succeeded by his family, and no amount of republican vocabulary changed that. Two further things about the settlement deserve attention because they determined how the next 4 centuries would run. The first is that Augustus solved the problem of the armies, and solved it by making them his. Under the Republic, legions had been raised for campaigns and disbanded afterward, and their loyalty had drifted toward whoever paid and settled them. Augustus made the army permanent and professional, fixed terms of service, fixed pay, and, critically, a treasury established to fund retirement grants, so that a soldier's settlement no longer depended on his general's ability to force a land bill through a hostile senate. The soldiers swore to the emperor. The retirement came from the state, which was the emperor. The mechanism that had produced Sulla and Caesar was diffused by removing the reason it had existed. It worked for a century, and then it began to work in reverse. Once the army knew it was the source of the emperor's position, it could withdraw the position. The 3rd century is what that looks like. The second problem was succession, and Augustus never solved it because it could not be solved. He held no office that could be inherited. There was no crown to pass and no law of succession, because officially there was no monarchy. What he could do was arrange for a chosen man to accumulate the same powers he held, so that when he died there was one person already holding the tribunician power, and a major command, and no plausible alternative. He did this repeatedly, and the men he chose kept dying. A nephew, then his closest friend and general, then 2 grandsons in quick succession. He was in his 70s before the eventual successor, his stepson Tiberius, was securely in place, and he does not appear to have liked him much. The system that emerged was dynastic without ever admitting it, which meant that every transfer of power was a moment of genuine danger, and that the empire periodically found itself governed by whoever happened to be related to the last man. There is one more episode from Augustus's reign that belongs in a story about boundaries. In the year 9, 3 legions under a commander named Varus were destroyed in forested country east of the Rhine, ambushed over several days by Germanic forces under a leader who had himself served with the Roman army and held Roman citizenship. Roughly 15,000 to 20,000 men were lost. The legionary numbers were never reissued. Suetonius records the aged emperor beating his head against a door and calling on Varus to give him back his legions. Rome did not seriously attempt to hold the territory beyond the Rhine again. That failure fixed a frontier that would matter for the next 400 years, and it did so in a specific way. The line between Roman and not Roman, which had been advancing steadily for centuries, stopped advancing in the north. It became a place rather than a process, a river with forts along it, a customs boundary, an edge, and an edge, unlike a process, is something people gather on the far side of. What he did not do was close the door. Under Augustus and his successors, the machinery for making new Romans continued running, and it ran in 2 directions at once, upward from slavery and inward from the provinces. Take the strange one first, because it genuinely puzzled contemporaries. Roman slavery was brutal, ubiquitous, and not based on race. Enslaved people had no legal personhood, no recognized family, no protection from violence or sexual use, and could be sold or killed by their owners. Nothing about what follows softens that. But Rome had a formal exit, and the exit led somewhere no other ancient slave system led. When a Roman citizen freed a slave through one of the recognized legal procedures, the freed person did not become a resident foreigner. They became a Roman citizen, not a full one. The stain of former servitude was real and was legally enforced. Freedmen could not hold magistracies, could not enter the Senate, could not serve in the legions, and were confined to a limited number of voting tribes, so their ballots counted for little. They owed continuing obligations to their former owner, who became their patron. Their children, however, were born free citizens with full rights. Greek observers found this remarkable and said so. Dionysius of Halicarnassus discusses it at length. The practice of enfranchising former slaves through formal manumission was understood. by outsiders and by Romans, as something that set Rome apart from its neighbours. The scholarly framing that helps here distinguishes closed slave systems from open ones. In a closed system, slavery permanently excludes a category of people from the community. In an open system, it functions more like a stage, a condition a person passes through with an institutional route out the other side. Rome was not humane. Rome was open in this specific, limited, legally structured way, and the difference is enormous over centuries. The scale is genuinely debated. Augustus legislated to restrict the practice, setting a minimum age of 30 for the freed person and 20 for the owner, requiring formal procedure before a magistrate for younger cases, and capping the number who could be freed by will. Those who did not meet the conditions received an inferior status with limited rights, upgradable under later law. Henrik Moritzen has argued that these restrictions were strikingly ineffective as regulation, and functioned more as ideological statements, official insistence on proper selection, and on citizenship as a privileged status worth coveting, which is precisely the point. Augustus was not trying to stop the process. He was trying to make the thing being granted feel valuable. Freedmen became one of the most economically active groups in the Roman world. They ran businesses, managed estates, held key positions in the imperial administration under Claudius and his successors, and some became extremely rich. The magnificent house at Pompeii, associated with the Vetii brothers, is generally thought to have belonged to former slaves. There is a detail preserved in a much later scholarly discussion that captures the strangeness of the system perfectly. In the 1st century, according to one account, educated Greeks would occasionally have themselves sold into slavery to a wealthy Roman needing a secretary, entrust the purchase money to a friend, and after an interval buy themselves back, thereby acquiring Roman citizenship, a door so wide that people were walking in through the worst possible entrance on purpose. The second direction was the provinces, and the best surviving evidence for how that argument actually sounded was found in a French garden in 1528. Workers at Lyon, Roman Lugdunum, turned up a bronze tablet carrying a speech. It is the longest speech by a Roman emperor to survive in inscribed form. The emperor is Claudius. The year is 48. The occasion was a petition. Leading men from the northern Gallic provinces, who already held Roman citizenship, wanted the right to hold office at Rome, and therefore to sit in the Senate. The opposition, as reported by Tacitus, was blunt. Italy was not so exhausted, they said, that it could not supply a Senate for its own capital. There was talk of the Gauls as recent enemies, of the sack of Rome by Gallic warriors centuries before, of what would be left for the old families. Claudius answered them with history, at length, in a manner that later readers have found pedantic, and that was in fact carefully constructed. He began with his own ancestors, some of whom, he noted, had come to Rome from elsewhere, and been made citizens and nobles in the same moment. He worked through the origins of the great families, the Julii from Alba, others from Camerium, others from Tusculum. He pointed out that senators had been drawn from Etruria, from Lucania, from all of Italy, and that Italy itself had been extended to the Alps. He reached back into Etruscan tradition for evidence about the regal period, material that survives nowhere else. And he made the argument that carries the whole thing, that the continual admission of outsiders into the citizen body and into the governing class had always been a structural feature of Roman expansion and the source of Roman greatness. Do not fear novelty, he told them, because we have been through many renewals here. He also named a specific man, Lucius Vestinus, from Vienne in Gaul, whom he described as a jewel of the equestrian order and kept in his service, and expressed the hope that Vestinus's children would hold priesthoods and rise further. Tacitus, composing his own version of the speech decades later, cut that passage, along with several others. He kept the central argument and tightened it considerably. The survival of both versions is one of the rare opportunities to watch an ancient historian at work on a source we also possess. The petition succeeded. The Aedui became the first Gallic people whose leading men could sit in the Roman Senate. Something should be said about the emperor making this argument. Claudius had a limp, a stammer, and a tremor. His family had regarded him as an embarrassment and kept him from public life for decades. He came to power after his nephew's assassination, reportedly discovered hiding behind a curtain by soldiers who proclaimed him. He was also the first Roman emperor born outside Italy. He was born at Lugdunum, Lyon, the city where the bronze copy of this speech was set up. The man who stood in front of the Roman Senate and argued that provincials belonged in it had himself been born in a province and excluded from public life by his own relatives. Scholars dispute what was actually being asked for. Some hold that these Gallic citizens possessed a limited citizenship, lacking the right to seek office at Rome, which would explain the petition. Others, including Sherwin-White and Syme, argue that no such legal restriction existed, and the barrier was social rather than legal. Either way, the barrier came down, and the tablet is still in Lyon, and you can read what an emperor said about who gets to belong. While senators argued about Gauls, the empire was manufacturing Romans at the frontier, one soldier at a time, and stamping the result on bronze. The imperial army had two main bodies. The legions were recruited from Roman citizens, the auxiliary units, the cavalry wings, and infantry cohorts, along with the fleets and certain formations at Rome, were recruited from provincials who were not citizens. For most of the first 2 centuries of the empire, non-citizens were the overwhelming majority of the population. The auxiliaries drew from exactly that pool: men from the Danube, from Syria, from Spain, from Thrace, from the Balkan interior, from Britain. They served for 25 years, 26 in the navy. At the end of that service, the emperor granted them Roman citizenship. The mechanism is worth following because it shows an empire treating enfranchisement as routine administration. The commander of a unit compiled a list of men due for discharge. It went to the provincial governor. The governor's office bundled the requests for the whole province and sent them to Rome. The imperial administration drew up a formal decree covering everyone on the list. The emperor approved it. A large bronze plate recording the decree was then set up publicly in Rome, and individual copies were made for each veteran. The copy is what we call a military diploma: 2 small rectangular bronze tablets joined with wire through holes at the corners, roughly the size of a hand. The full text was engraved on the outer face of the first tablet and repeated inside. The outer face of the second carried the names and seals of 7 witnesses, protected under a metal strip. The word diploma comes from the Greek for doubled or folded in 2, which is precisely what the object is. More than 1,000 of them are known. They have been found across the empire, concentrated in the frontier provinces, and because they record the recipient's origin, they let us map recruitment. The middle and lower Danube stands out as an enormous supplier of manpower. The grant conferred citizenship, and it conferred the right of legal marriage. That second element mattered more than it sounds. Serving soldiers were formally prohibited from marrying until the reign of Septimius Severus. In practice, they formed lasting relationships with local women and raised children. The diploma retroactively regularized those families, making the union valid in law and the children legitimate citizens. For much of the period, citizenship extended to the veterans' existing children as well. Around the year 140, that provision was narrowed. Later still, additional proof requirements were inserted regarding wives and paternity. A grant under Hadrian, known from 3 surviving diplomas, extended the status to the recipient's parents and siblings. You can watch the policy being tuned across decades, tightened here, relaxed there, in the ordinary manner of a bureaucracy managing a valuable commodity. Consider what one of these objects meant to the man holding it. A boy from a village on the Danube with no legal standing in the Roman world enlists. He spends the whole of his adult life in uniform, in provinces he had never heard of, under officers speaking a language he learns on the job. He forms a household that the law does not recognize. He survives. And then a folded piece of bronze arrives with 7 seals on it. And he is a Roman citizen, and his woman is his wife, and his children are legitimate, and he can no longer be flogged at a magistrate's discretion, and he no longer pays the head tax that non-citizens pay. Many of these men did not go home. Roughly half remained near where they had served. Others retired to civilian communities, sometimes their birthplaces, carrying the status with them. And their neighbours saw what 25 years brought. The empire was recruiting on a promise and paying out. The whole apparatus was made largely redundant in the year 212, for reasons we will come to. A century after Varus, an emperor made that idea visible in stone, and you can still walk along it. Hadrian came to power in the year 117, following an emperor who had pushed the empire to its greatest extent. Hadrian's first significant decision was to give some of that back, abandoning recent eastern conquests he judged indefensible, and his reign was then spent travelling the provinces and fixing what he had. In Britain, around the year 122, he ordered a barrier built across the narrow neck of the island. It runs about 117 kilometres, coast to coast, stone for most of its length, turf at the western end initially, with a ditch in front, a substantial earthwork behind, forts set at intervals along it, smaller fortlets at roughly every Roman mile, and turrets between those. It was not primarily a defensive line in the sense of a rampart to be fought over, though it could serve that way. Its more consistent function appears to have been control, regulating and taxing movement, channeling people through gates where they could be counted, making the crossing of a boundary a supervised event rather than a casual one, which is, in every meaningful respect, the pomerium at imperial scale. Consider the resemblance carefully, a line whose purpose is not to stop an army, but to define a difference. Gates deliberately built into it, because a boundary without a door is a tomb, a physical statement that inside this, one set of rules applies, and outside it, another. The furrow ploughed around a village on the Palatine had become a stone wall across northern Britain, and it was doing the same job. What is on? That wall makes the point sharper still. The garrisons were auxiliary units, and the inscriptions record where they came from. Cohorts raised in Spain, in Gaul, in the Rhineland, in the Balkans, in Syria. Men from one end of the empire standing on the far edge of the other, watching a boundary they had never heard of before they enlisted, waiting for the bronze diploma. That would make them Roman. At Vindolanda, just south of the wall, waterlogged ground preserved something even better than inscriptions. Thin wooden leaves, written on in ink, thrown out as rubbish and never rotting. They are letters, ordinary ones, requisitions for supplies, notes about the state of the roads, a report on troop strength, requests for warm clothing. In one of them, the wife of a commander invites the wife of another officer to a birthday party, in a note partly written by a scribe, with a personal greeting added at the end in her own hand. It is among the earliest surviving handwriting by a woman in Latin, and it concerns a party in a fort at the northern edge of the known world. That is what the boundary looked like from the inside. Not a heroic frontier, an administrative posting, with paperwork and social obligations and complaints about the weather. The ancient evidence from Britain fits the genetic picture as well. Analysis of remains from Roman period sites in Britain, including in the north, has identified individuals with North African and Middle Eastern ancestry, people who were stationed there, lived there, and were buried there. A soldier from the Syrian desert, on a wall in Northumberland, waiting on his citizenship. Everything about tonight is contained in that image. The line, drawn absolutely, the gate, built into it deliberately, and the person standing on it, who came from somewhere else entirely, and who was on his way in. It is worth asking what all this belonging actually bought in the ordinary life of an ordinary person, because a legal status is an abstraction until it touches something. Start with law, since that is what citizenship principally was. Roman law was a genuine technology, developed over centuries by professionals, who treated it as an intellectual discipline. It produced concepts that had no real equivalent elsewhere in the ancient world. A worked-out theory of contract, of property, of inheritance, of liability for harm, of the difference between possessing something and owning it. For a citizen, this meant that a dispute with a neighbour had a procedure. Agreements could be enforced. A will could direct property after death and be relied upon. Marriage had legal consequences that survived the death of either party. For a non-citizen, none of that applied. Local custom governed instead, which might be perfectly serviceable, but which stopped at the edge of the community and could not reach across the empire. That is the practical difference the diplomas and the grants were conferring. Not a passport, a legal existence that travelled. Then there is the infrastructure, which historians sometimes treat as decoration, and which was nothing of the sort. The roads were built for armies, and used by everyone. They were engineered, surveyed, drained, cambered, laid in courses, marked with stones giving distances. They connected the provinces to each other rather than merely to the centre, and they made it possible for a merchant, a message, a legal summons or a bishop to move across a continent at a predictable speed. The water supply is the more astonishing achievement. Rome drew water from sources in the hills tens of kilometres away, along channels engineered to fall at a consistent and very slight gradient across that whole distance, carried underground, where possible, and on arcaded bridges where the ground fell away. The city received an enormous volume daily, feeding fountains, baths, latrines and industry. Provincial cities across the empire built their own versions, at smaller scale, because that was what a proper city had. And there was the grain. Rome could not feed itself from its own hinterland, and had not been able to for centuries. It imported enormous quantities by sea, principally from North Africa and Egypt, administered as a state responsibility, with a subsidized and later free distribution to a registered list of citizens. Note who was on the list. Citizens. The bread was a benefit of status. Something should be said honestly here, because a description of aqueducts and law codes can slide into advertisement. All of it rested on slavery, on conquest, and on the systematic extraction of wealth from provinces that had not asked to be provinces. The tax farming arrangements produced the abuses Cicero prosecuted. The estates producing the grain were worked by people who had been captured. The baths were heated by people who had no legal existence at all. The empire was not a public service. It was an extractive structure that happened to require infrastructure in order to extract efficiently. Both things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is the reason the Roman question is still argued about. But the point for tonight is narrower. Whatever else the empire was, it was a going concern that could be joined. And people did join it, not because they had been persuaded, in most cases, but because membership was materially better than non-membership, and because the route in was visible and reasonably well signposted. That is a rare thing in the ancient world, and it is the reason a village on a floodplain ended up running the Mediterranean. Before that, a question about the city itself. Who actually lived in Rome? The literary sources are unhelpful. Roman writers mention foreigners constantly, usually with irritation, and the satirists complain about the Syrian river emptying into the Tiber. That tells us about elite anxiety, not about population. Two sets of scientific evidence now speak to the question, and they broadly agree. The first is isotopic. The chemistry of drinking water and diet varies geographically, and traces of that variation are locked into tooth enamel as it forms in childhood, and into bone as it remodels. Compare the two, and you can identify people who did not grow up where they were buried. A study of individuals from a cemetery serving Rome's port, dating from the 1st to 3rd centuries, found that roughly a third had childhood values outside the expected local range. It also found something the historical sources had not suggested: a group who appear to have arrived in the area between roughly 10 and 17 years of age. Migration was not confined to adult men. A later analysis of over 100 individuals from 2 cemeteries associated with Imperial Rome identified likely immigrants, including both. men and children, and found that carbon values from teeth and bone differed, suggesting these people had substantially changed their diet after arriving. The bioarchaeologist Christina Kilgrove, who conducted much of this work, has noted that the immigrants appear to have had a broadly similar quality of life to locals: comparable food, comparable diseases, comparable ages at death. They were not a separate population living separately. They were absorbed. The second body of evidence is genetic, and it is more recent and more startling. In 2019, a team published an analysis of 127 ancient genomes from 29 archaeological sites in and around Rome, spanning 12,000 years. The deep pattern tracks the rest of Europe. Hunter-gatherers, then an ancestry shift as farming populations arrived from Anatolia, then a further shift in the Bronze Age. Then the empire happens, and the graph moves. During the imperial period, the sampled population of Rome shows substantial net immigration from the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, alongside contributions from North Africa and elsewhere. The city's genetic profile shifted markedly within a few centuries. One geneticist quoted at the time compared imperial Rome to a modern metropolis, a concentration of people of different origins joining together. The lead researchers described the speed of the change as the most surprising finding, and noted that the cosmopolitan character began more than 2,000 years ago and continued through the rise and dissolution of the empire. A later study extended the approach across the whole empire, sequencing 204 new genomes from over 50 sites in 18 countries. It found that at least 8% of individuals sampled did not originate in the part of Europe, Africa, or Asia where they were buried. And then the closing observation, which belongs at the end of tonight rather than here. But note it now. After the Western Empire ended, the population of Rome drifted back towards something resembling its earlier profile. The genetics follow the boundary. When the empire was open, the city filled with the world. When the connections broke, it emptied. Two caveats stated plainly. These are samples, not censuses, and the number of individuals is small relative to a city that may have held 1 million people, and genetic ancestry is not identity. The point of Roman citizenship was precisely that it was not about descent, but something happened in imperial Rome that left a signal in bone and in tooth enamel, and it is consistent with everything the legal history has been telling us. Which brings us to the year 212 and to an emperor with a bad reputation and an extraordinary decree. Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus is known to history as Caracalla, after a hooded cloak he favoured. He had come to power alongside his brother Geta in 211 on the death of their father, and had murdered his brother later, that same year. In 212, or possibly early in 213, he issued an edict granting Roman citizenship to essentially all free inhabitants of the empire. We call it the Constitutio Antoniniana. It survives in a single fragmentary Greek copy on a papyrus acquired by the university at Gießen in the early 20th century, recognised for what it was only, after purchase, and now inscribed on the Register of Documentary World Heritage. The text is damaged. There are exclusions for a category called the Dedititiae, whose precise definition remains disputed. The papyrus preserves a preamble in which the emperor gives thanks to the gods for his own preservation and expresses a wish to render that thanks together with all who are now his people. One surviving phrase is often translated to the effect that the new citizens would bear all the burdens while also sharing in the victory. The burdens meant taxes and civic obligations. The consequences were immediate and visible in the documentary record. New citizens took the emperor's family name. Papyri and inscriptions across the Eastern Empire fill up with men and women called Aurelius and Aurelia. One document from a few years later identifies a man as Aurelius Zosimos, who before the divine gift was called simply Zosimos, son of Leonides. You can see individual people acquiring a new name and a new status in the same line of text. The motives have been argued over ever since, and the arguments fall into recognizable camps. Cassius Dio, a senator writing not long afterward and hostile to the dynasty, said the reason was money, that Caracalla wanted more people liable for the taxes citizens paid, including the inheritance tax, which he had also raised. Modern historians have pointed out that Dio had every reason to be uncharitable, and that the fiscal calculation is genuinely complicated, since new citizens also stopped paying the head tax levied on non-citizens. Others have emphasized the religious framing the papyrus itself supplies and the desire to unite the population in an act of thanksgiving at a moment when the emperor's legitimacy was severely compromised by fratricide. Others still have argued for a military logic, broadening the pool available for legionary recruitment, which had been drawing on citizens. Recent monograph-length treatments tend to conclude that no single motive is sufficient, and that the edict served short-term legitimacy needs alongside longer-term fiscal and military ones, and there is a further scholarly divide about whether it mattered at all. One school treats it as the logical conclusion of a process that had been running for centuries. Another treats it as a document given retrospective importance, changing little in daily life, and reflecting nothing more than an autocrat's gesture. Here the narrator is going to disagree with both camps, and the disagreement is the heart of tonight. The edict was the culmination of everything we have been following. From the asylum, to the Latin rites, to the social war, to the diplomas, to Claudius at Lyon, Rome had been widening the definition of Roman for 900 years. Caracalla finished the job. In that sense, it is the single most inclusive act in ancient political history, and it deserves the recognition it has. And it was a catastrophe, precisely because it worked. Consider what Roman citizenship had actually been doing all that time. It had been a reward. The auxiliary served 25 years for it. The Gallic notable pursued it across generations. The freed slave received it as the reason to serve loyally. The Italian communities went to war for it. The provincial city petitioned for it and celebrated on stone when it arrived. Its power came entirely from being withheld. Citizenship was Rome's cheapest and most effective instrument of loyalty. It cost the treasury almost nothing to issue, and it bought genuine attachment, because to receive it was to be raised above your neighbours. And to be raised above your neighbours, you had to give the empire something first. After 212, that instrument no longer existed. Everybody had it. Nobody could be given it. A thing possessed by all free inhabitants of an empire of perhaps 50 or 60 million people is not a reward. It is a background condition, like the weather. The empire had just converted its most powerful tool of assimilation into an administrative fact, and it did so, as it happens, about 20 years before the worst 50 years in its history. This reading should be flagged as interpretation rather than consensus, and there are reasonable objections to it. The status still carried real legal consequences, particularly in family law, marriage, and inheritance, and one recent major study argues that this is where the edict's genuine impact lay. Legal distinctions also promptly reappeared in a different form, dividing citizens by rank into the more honourable and the more humble, with sharply different punishments. Society found new lines to draw almost immediately, but those new lines were about status within Rome. The old line had been about whether you were in Rome at all, and it had been an engine. After 212, the engine was switched off. Rome would spend the next 2 centuries trying to bind people to itself, and would have to do it with land grants, treaties, subsidies and titles, instruments that were expensive, temporary, and negotiated with people who could walk away. The century that followed is usually called the crisis of the 3rd century, and the name is not an exaggeration. The conventional dates run from 235, when the Emperor Severus Alexander was murdered by his own soldiers, to 284, when Diocletian took power. In those 49 years, something like 26 men were recognized by the Senate as legitimate emperors, and considerably more claimed the title without recognition. Most died violently. Almost none died of old age. The pattern was self-reinforcing. Armies on the frontiers proclaimed their own commanders. The commander marched on his rivals. Frontiers went unwatched, while the troops fought each other. Whoever won had to buy the loyalty of the soldiers who had made him, and buying it meant money. The money came from the coinage, which was debased steadily until the silver content of the standard coin had collapsed. Prices rose accordingly, trade contracted, urban populations fell. The town councillors, whose local wealth funded municipal life, were squeezed between tax obligations they were personally liable for and an inflation that destroyed their assets. Meanwhile, the pressure from outside increased. Germanic groups crossed the Rhine and the Danube. A revitalized Persian Empire pushed hard in the east and, in 260, captured the Emperor Valerian alive in battle, a humiliation without precedent. And then the empire came apart into pieces. In the west, a commander named Postumus established what modern historians call the Gallic Empire, covering Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, with its own capital, its own coinage, and its own succession of emperors. In the east, the caravan city of Palmyra, having first defended Roman interests against Persia with conspicuous success, expanded under the Queen Zenobia to control Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor. For over a decade, there were 3 Roman states. Both breakaway regimes claimed to be protecting Roman interests. Neither described itself as a rebellion against Rome. They were arguments about where the centre was, conducted by people who all considered themselves Roman. The empire was reunified by force, mainly by Aurelian, who defeated the Palmyrenes, brought the Gallic Empire back, abandoned the exposed province north of the Danube, and built a new wall around the city of Rome itself, the first serious fortification the capital had needed in 600 years. He was murdered by his own guards in 275. That wall around Rome is worth dwelling on for a moment. The old fortification, attributed to the 6th king, had been irrelevant for centuries. The city had spilled far beyond it, and no serious person had expected an enemy within reach of Italy. Since Hannibal, Rome was defended by the distance between itself and any frontier. In the 270s, a Germanic force reached northern Italy, and the emperor concluded that the distance was no longer a defence. The wall that went up runs for something like 19 kilometres, enclosing a vastly larger area than the archaic circuit. It was built fast, and it was built cheaply, incorporating existing structures wherever they stood in the right place, so that tombs, aqueduct arches, an amphitheatre and a pyramid were absorbed into it, and can still be picked out. Much of it is still standing. Think about what it means for a city to build a wall after 700 years without needing one. Rome had spent its whole history exporting boundaries. Every colony got a ploughed furrow. Every frontier province got forts and roads and a customs line. The capital itself had needed nothing but a sacred strip of undeveloped ground, because the actual defences were 1,000 kilometres away in every direction. Now the capital had a wall, and the sacred line inside it was a religious antiquity rather than a working institution. The crisis produced other permanent changes. The Senate was progressively excluded from military command, a process usually associated with the Emperor Gallienus, who promoted professional officers from the equestrian order instead. The consequence was a high command drawn from career soldiers rather than from the aristocracy, more competent and considerably less attached to the old political order. Emperors stopped living in Rome. They lived where the armies were, on the Rhine, on the Danube, in the east. Cities like Trier, Milan, Sirmium and Nicomedia became working capitals because they were near frontiers, while Rome kept the Senate and the monuments and the ceremony. And the local elites who had funded municipal life, the councillors who paid for the baths and the games, and the water supply out of their own pockets in exchange for standing, were destroyed as a class. They remained personally liable for their town's tax quotas while inflation obliterated their wealth. Membership of a town council, once competed for, became an obligation people tried to escape, and eventually a hereditary trap enforced by law. That last change matters more than it sounds. The system by which local ambition had been converted into local investment stopped working. Roughly a generation after the system by which imperial ambition had been converted into loyalty stopped working. Both had run on the same principle: give people something worth having in exchange for something worth doing. By the end of the 3rd century, the state was compelling both sides of that bargain by statute, which is what you do when the bargain has stopped being attractive. But the empire had survived, and what emerged from the crisis was a different kind of state entirely. Diocletian came from the Balkans, from the ordinary ranks of the army, and he reorganized the Roman state so thoroughly that historians use his reign as a boundary marker between antiquity and what comes after. His central diagnosis was that the empire was too large for one man to govern and too tempting for one man to hold. His answer was to divide the job. The system he built is called the Tetrarchy, rule by 4, 2 senior emperors, each carrying the title Augustus, one in the east and one in the west, 2 junior emperors, each carrying the title Caesar, attached to a senior and intended to succeed him, 4 courts, 4 regions, 4 armies close enough to 4 frontiers to respond quickly. Underneath it, he multiplied the administrative layers. Provinces were subdivided into smaller units, grouped into larger districts, grouped again into great regional prefectures. Civil authority was separated from military authority, so that the man who collected the taxes in a region was not the man who commanded its troops. The army was reorganized into frontier garrisons and mobile field forces. Taxation was rebuilt on a systematic assessment of land and labor. An attempt was made to control inflation by fixing maximum prices across the empire, which failed comprehensively, as such attempts generally do, and the presentation of imperial power changed completely. Augustus had called himself Princeps, first citizen, and had gone to considerable trouble to be seen walking about like a senator among senators. Diocletian used the title Dominus, Lord. Access became ceremonial. Approaching the emperor involved prostration. The costume became elaborate, the setting deliberately overwhelming. Historians call the resulting system the Dominate, in contrast to the earlier Principate. And the difference is not merely stylistic. The Republican theatre had been abandoned. Nobody was pretending anymore. Diocletian also launched the last and most severe persecution of Christians, beginning in 303, on the reasoning that religious unity was a matter of state security, and that a group refusing to participate in public sacrifice endangered everyone. Churches were destroyed, scriptures seized, clergy imprisoned, and those who refused to sacrifice were executed. Enforcement varied enormously by region, brutal in the east, minimal in Gaul and Britain. It failed, and it failed visibly, which mattered. Then Diocletian did something no Roman emperor had done. In 305, he abdicated and required his colleague to do the same, and retired to a fortified palace on the Dalmatian coast to grow vegetables. The succession system collapsed almost immediately, because sons of emperors declined to accept being passed over. The man who came out of the resulting wars was Constantine, proclaimed by the army in Britain on his father's death, and by 324, the sole ruler of the whole empire. 2 of his decisions reshaped the world. The first concerned religion, before a battle at the Milvian Bridge outside Rome in 312. Constantine reportedly experienced a vision and ordered a Christian symbol placed on his soldiers' shields. He won and attributed the victory to the Christian god. The following year, meeting his eastern colleague Licinius at Milan, he agreed a policy of toleration, ending the persecution and restoring confiscated property. That agreement did not make Christianity the state religion. It made the empire officially neutral, and then Constantine spent the rest of his reign being conspicuously unneutral, funding church construction, granting clergy privileges, and in 325 summoning bishops from across the empire to settle a doctrinal dispute, which is a remarkable thing for a Roman emperor to be doing. The formal establishment of Christianity as the religion of the Roman state came later, under Theodosius, in 300, and 80. The second decision was geographic. Constantine refounded the Greek city of Byzantium on the straits between Europe and Asia and named it after himself. Look at the position. It sits on the crossing between two continents, controls the sea route between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, is defensible on three sides by water, and stands far closer to the wealthy eastern provinces and to the Persian frontier than Rome does. Constantinople was not a copy of Rome. It was a correction of Rome. The old capital had been in the wrong place for 2 centuries, too far from the frontiers that mattered, too far from the money. And notice what this does to our line. The Pomerium ran around a set of hills in central Italy. It was the sacred boundary of a specific city, ploughed by a founder, marked with stones by emperors, defended by ritual for 1,000 years. The emperor now lived somewhere else. The capital was a new foundation on the Bosphorus. Rome kept its senate, its prestige, its monuments and its enormous population, and lost its function. The city at the centre of the story was no longer at the centre of anything. Now the frontier, and the process by which it stopped being a frontier. Rome had always dealt with peoples beyond its borders, through a mixture of war, subsidy, trade and treaty. Groups were settled inside the empire on occasion, recruited into the army routinely, and bound by agreements called foedera, from which comes the term foederati, allied peoples serving under treaty. None of that was new in the 4th century. What changed was the balance. In 376, large numbers of Goths arrived at the Danube seeking admission. They were fleeing the Huns, whose westward movement was displacing populations across the steppe. Estimates of their number vary widely and should be treated with caution. Tens of thousands is a reasonable order of magnitude, including families. The Eastern Emperor Valens agreed to let them cross. There were sound reasons. The empire needed recruits, and here were fighting men arriving voluntarily. The management of the crossing was a disaster. Roman officials responsible for provisioning the refugees exploited them instead, withholding food and extracting what they could. Hunger produced desperation. Desperation produced raiding, and within a year the Danube frontier was in open war. On the 9th of August, 378, Valens engaged the Gothic force outside Adrianople in Thrace. He had reasons to hurry that were political rather than military. His western colleague had recently won victories against Germanic groups in Gaul, and was on his way east with reinforcements. Valens wanted the credit. He appears to have received an inaccurate estimate of enemy strength. Gothic negotiators kept talks going while their cavalry returned. The battle was a catastrophe. The Eastern Field Army was largely destroyed, perhaps 2/3 of the force engaged, along with a great many experienced officers. Valens died on the field. His body was never recovered. Ammianus Marcellinus, a soldier and the finest historian of the late empire, reached for the worst comparison available. "No such slaughter," he wrote, "since Cannae." Note the reference. 600 years after the fact, a Roman writer measuring disaster still measured it against Hannibal. The new Eastern Emperor, Theodosius, spent 4 years failing to destroy the Goths militarily, and then, in 382, made a treaty. The terms are the important part. The Goths were settled on land within the empire. They retained their own internal leadership and a substantial degree of autonomy. They served as a body under their own commanders in exchange for the arrangement. This was not unprecedented in kind, but it was different in degree. A group had entered the empire, defeated a Roman field army, killed an emperor, and been settled inside the frontier as a semi-autonomous entity rather than being dispersed and absorbed. The line had been crossed, and the crossers had not been dissolved. Over the following century, this pattern became normal. Groups were settled, given land or a share of tax revenue, and employed as fighting forces. Their leaders acquired Roman titles and Roman offices and married into Roman families. The senior commanders of the Western Army increasingly came from beyond the old frontier. The traditional term for this is barbarization, and the term deserves a hard look. It carries an implication that the army was diluted by outsiders and therefore became worse, that this weakness explains the collapse. That framing is very old, and it has been used to carry arguments that have nothing to do with the 4th century. 2 objections. First, Rome had been recruiting from beyond and along its frontiers for centuries, and the auxiliary system had processed exactly these populations into citizens for 200 years without weakening anything. Second, the armies of the late empire were not conspicuously incompetent. They won a great many engagements. Commanders of non-Roman origin fought loyally and effectively, and several of them were the most capable soldiers the West possessed. The narrator's position is that barbarization is a description dressed as an explanation, and it explains nothing. What actually changed was not the ethnicity of the soldiers, it was the terms of service. The auxiliary of the 2nd century served as an individual under Roman officers for 25 years, and at the end of it he was made Roman. The federate of the 5th century served as a member of a group, under his own leaders, under a treaty that could be renegotiated, and at the end of it he was still a member of that group. Rome had lost the ability to turn outsiders into insiders, because after 212 there was no longer anything to turn them into. Citizenship was universal, and therefore worthless as an incentive. So the empire paid in land, in revenue, in titles, and in autonomy, and each payment left the recipient more capable of demanding the next one. The door in the furrow had not been closed. It had been widened until it was indistinguishable from the wall. There is one episode from the intervening century that has to be told, because of what it reveals about who these people actually were. The Goths settled under the Treaty of 382 did not remain settled. Their position depended on agreements with individual emperors, and agreements lapse. Payments were withheld. Commands promised were not granted. The arrangement was renegotiated by both sides, repeatedly, and each renegotiation happened at the point of a spear because there was no other mechanism. Their leader for much of this period was Alaric. He is conventionally described as a barbarian king leading an invasion, and that description obscures nearly everything of interest about him. Alaric had commanded Gothic troops in Roman service. He had fought in a Roman civil war on the winning side. He held, or had held, a senior Roman military rank. What he wanted, through more than a decade of negotiation, was not the destruction of the empire. He wanted a permanent settlement for his people, regular supply, and a formal command within the Roman military structure. He spent years trying to obtain those things by negotiation. He marched on Italy several times as a means of applying pressure to those negotiations, which is a tactic rather than a strategy of conquest. In 408, and again in 409, he besieged Rome to force terms. He installed a puppet emperor at one point, and then abandoned him, in an attempt to find someone in the Western government who would make a deal that stuck. In August of 410, the talks having failed once more, his forces entered the city. The sack lasted 3 days. It was, by the standards of ancient urban warfare, restrained. Churches were treated as places of sanctuary and largely respected. The city was not burned or systematically levelled. People were killed and a great deal of property was taken, and the survivors did not experience it as restrained, but Rome was not destroyed. The psychological effect across the Mediterranean was enormous and out of all proportion to the physical damage. Rome had not been taken by a foreign force in 800 years. Since the Gauls, the city was no longer the capital, no longer the seat of government, no longer strategically significant, and none of that mattered. Refugees carried the news to North Africa and to the eastern provinces. Jerome, in Palestine, wrote that his voice failed him and sobs interrupted his dictation. Augustine of Hippo began writing an enormous work of theology in response, arguing that Christians should not have expected an earthly city to last, and that the city that mattered was not built of stone. Alaric died within months of illness in southern Italy. His people moved on into Gaul and eventually into Spain, where they founded a kingdom that lasted 300 years and that governed a Roman population using Roman law written in Latin. Hold the sequence in mind. A commander who had served Rome seeking a Roman command and a settlement for his followers, forced to take the old capital because no one would sign anything, and whose successors then spent centuries administering Roman provinces in Roman fashion. That is not an invasion from outside. That is a failed negotiation inside a system that no longer had a way of saying yes. Which brings us, finally, to Ravenna. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Empire was a much reduced thing. Britain had been let go. Much of Spain and Gaul was under the control of groups operating with varying degrees of nominal loyalty. North Africa, the grain supply, had been lost to the Vandals. Rome itself had been sacked twice, by Alaric's Goths in 410 and by the Vandals in 455. The imperial court sat at Ravenna, chosen for its marshes and its harbour. Real power in the West lay with whoever held the senior military command. Emperors were made, and unmade by their generals with monotonous regularity. In 475, a commander named Orestes drove out the reigning emperor, Julius Nepos, who withdrew to Dalmatia and continued to claim the throne. Orestes did not take the title himself. He gave it to his son, a boy of perhaps 10 or 15. The boy's name was Romulus, because he was a child, and because it was funny, people called him Augustulus, Little Augustus. He held the office for 10 months. There are no known laws, policies or inscriptions of any consequence from his reign, because he did not govern. His father governed. Orestes had a problem. The troops on whom his position rested were federate soldiers in the Roman army, and they wanted land in Italy, a share of the estates, or of the revenue from them, as settlement for their service. He had, it seems, promised something along these lines. He refused to deliver. They found a leader among their own officers, a man named Odoacer, of uncertain origin and long service. In August of 476, Odoacer defeated Orestes near Piacenza and had him executed. On the 4th of September, he took Ravenna and required the boy to abdicate. And then he did something strange. He did not claim the imperial title. He took the title of king, and he gathered the imperial regalia, the vestments and insignia of the Western emperors, and sent them to Constantinople, to the Eastern emperor Zeno, with the message that the West no longer required an emperor of its own. He accepted the rank of patrician from Zeno. He ruled Italy with the cooperation of the Roman Senate, which continued to meet. He kept the administration, the law, the taxation, the offices, and the Latin language. He distributed land to his followers and governed for 17 years. Zeno, for his part, performed some diplomatic contortions, insisting that Julius Nepos remained the legitimate Western emperor, while accepting Odoacer's position in practice. Nepos was murdered in 480. The boy Romulus was not killed. Odoacer sent him to a fortified villa in Campania, near Naples, with relatives and a retinue, and granted him an annual income of 6,000 gold coins, the income of a wealthy senator. He may have lived another 30 or 50 years. A letter from Theodoric the Great, written in the early 6th century, appears to refer to him. He may have been involved in founding a monastery at the villa. The last Western Roman emperor drew a pension and outlived his own office by decades. Now, the interpretation, because this date carries more weight than it can bear. 476 is the wrong date, and it is wrong for a reason that illuminates everything. There was no invasion. Odoacer's soldiers were the Western Roman army, federate units in Roman service, commanded by a Roman officer, quartered in Italy, demanding the settlement terms their service entitled them to. This was not a foreign conquest. It was a mutiny over pay. No city was stormed. No emperor was killed. The Senate continued sitting. The taxes continued being collected. The courts continued applying Roman law. Most people in Italy would have noticed nothing beyond a change in who held the top job, which had happened repeatedly within living memory. Contemporaries did not experience it as the end of anything. The date acquired its significance later from a 6th century chronicler, and then from the whole tradition of historians who needed a clean line between the ancient world and what came next. Peter Heather has described the deposition as the logical conclusion of a process of disintegration that had been running for a century. That is right. The formal act was the last visible consequence of changes that had already happened. But here is the thing worth carrying away from tonight. What ended in 476 was not Rome. What ended was the distinction between Roman and not Roman. That distinction is the whole story. It is the furrow ploughed on the Palatine, and the door in it on the Capitoline. It is the marriage ban in the 12 Tables, and its repeal 5 years later. It is Latin rights and voting tribes, and the allies who built a rival capital to demand entry. It is the freed slave who becomes a citizen, and the auxiliary with his bronze diploma, and the Gallic notables, who wanted seats in the Senate and got them. It is Cicero prosecuting a governor for crucifying a man who kept shouting that he was a Roman citizen because the words were supposed to stop the cross being raised, and everyone in that courtroom understood that Rome depended on them meaning something. It is Caracalla in 212 granting the status to everyone, and thereby ending the mechanism that had made Rome capable of absorbing the world. By 476, there was no longer anything for the boundary to separate. The soldiers were Roman. The general was Roman in every functional sense. The government was Roman. The only thing missing was a man in Ravenna wearing the vestments, and Odoacer put those in a box and sent them east because the position had become decorative. You cannot fall over a line that has stopped existing. And there is a final turn, which is the reason to be careful with the word ended. In the east, nothing ended at all. The Eastern Empire continued without interruption, governed from Constantinople, with an unbroken succession of emperors, Roman law, Roman administration, and Roman taxation. It reconquered Italy, and North Africa in the 6th century held the Balkans and Asia Minor for centuries, lost enormous territory to the Arab conquests, recovered, declined, and endured. The reconquest deserves a paragraph of its own, because it is the last time the whole thing was attempted. In the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian, ruling from Constantinople, set out to recover the West. His generals took North Africa from the Vandals in a campaign of startling speed. Then they went into Italy against the Ostrogothic kingdom that had replaced Odoacer's, and the war there ground on for roughly 2 decades. It succeeded, technically. Italy was recovered. It also ruined the peninsula. The long campaigns wrecked the countryside, emptied the cities, and destroyed the fragile arrangement under which Gothic kings had been governing a Roman population, with Roman institutions largely intact. Rome itself changed hands repeatedly, and was left, by the end, a fraction of what it had been. The Senate, which had survived the fall of the Western Empire and gone on meeting for another half-century, disappears from the record shortly afterward. Then plague arrived in the early 1540s and swept the whole Mediterranean world with mortality that no state could absorb. Justinian's other project outlasted the conquests. He ordered the entire mass of Roman law, centuries of statutes, imperial rulings and juristic commentary, collected, sorted, reconciled and codified. The result preserved the legal tradition in a usable form and transmitted it forward. Rediscovered in medieval Italy, it became the foundation of the legal systems of most of continental Europe, and through them of much of the world. The armies took Italy, and lost it again within a generation, to the Lombards. The lawyers took the whole future. We call these people Byzantines. They never used the word. The name is a scholarly coinage, popularized in the 16th century by a German editor, built on the old name of the city that had been renamed more than 1,000 years before. It exists to separate them from Rome. They called themselves Romaioi, Romans. Their state was the Empire of the Romans. In ordinary speech, their country was Romania, the land of the Romans. Their capital was New Rome. They spoke Greek and considered it the Roman language, and their neighbours agreed. In Arabic, they were al-Rum. In Persian, Rum. In Armenian, Syriac and Chinese, the same root appears. Every language that met them across a real border accepted that this was Rome. When the Ottoman Turks took Anatolia, they named their sultanate after the Romans they had taken it from, and when they crossed into Europe, they called the Balkans Rumelia, the land of the Romans. Anthony Caldelis has argued, at length and with a certain exasperation, that the refusal to call these people Roman is a modern imposition, and that we should take their self-description seriously. Not every scholar accepts every part of his case. Almost all now accept the continuity. The Roman identity persisted until the end, and past it. On the 29th of May, 1453, the last emperor, Constantine, died fighting on the walls of Constantinople as the Ottoman army came over. Under Ottoman rule, the Orthodox population continued to be called Rum and continued to call themselves Romans for centuries. Count the distance from a furrow on the Palatine to the walls of Constantinople is something over 2,200 years, which is a very long time for a word to survive. So, go back to the beginning and let it settle, somewhere beneath the modern city, under the paving and the foundations and the layers of 19 centuries. There is a line of consecrated dirt. It was ploughed by someone whose name we do not reliably know, in a year we cannot fix, around a village of thatched huts on a hill above a marsh. Nothing was ever built on it. Nothing was farmed on it. Generals stopped at it. Emperors carried stones to mark it, and inscribed their names on the stones, and buried them upright in the ground. And a few of those stones are still down there, and one of them came up out of a sewer a few years ago, with the name of Claudius on it, perfectly legible. It was only ever a strip of empty ground. It held for 1,000 years because people agreed to stop, and it ended, quietly, when they stopped agreeing. Not in fire, not in ruin, but on an ordinary September afternoon in a marsh town, when a soldier decided the office was no longer necessary, and put the purple in a box, and a boy named after the founder went south to a villa by the sea, with a pension and a household, and grew old there, and looked out at the water for another 30 or 40 years, while the world he had briefly and nominally ruled carried on being Roman in a different language, a long way to the east, for another 1,000 years. Sleep well.